Hey everybody, welcome back to Tim Travels. I'm your host Terry, coming to you from the global corporate headquarters here at Springfield, Missouri. So I want to get into, I had a meeting yesterday with some folks here at Prime. I guess you would say they're in my chain of command, and I'll get to that in a minute, but today's July 20th, and it's a momentous day in the history of the United States and in the history of like scientific endeavor. Today is the anniversary, which happened in 1969, of Apollo 11 landing on the moon, and two of its three astronauts actually exiting the lunar module and going out on the surface of the moon. Those two guys, the first guy out was Neil Armstrong. He was the mission commander. Second guy out was Buzz Aldrin, who was the lunar module pilot. There was a third astronaut on the mission, Michael Collins. He was the command module pilot. So, you know, and Neil Armstrong and Michael Collins have passed away. Buzz Aldrin's still with us. By the way, Buzz's first name is actually Edwin. His parents did not have enough foresight to actually name him Buzz. Anyway, you know, it was momentous. It was, you know, fulfilling President Kennedy's goal, not really a dream, a goal of putting somebody on the moon by the end of the decade. And he made that statement in 1961. And, you know, NASA and the military and the United States got it done. The launch, and I distinctly remember this day because it was, you know, I lived in Florida. I lived in Port St. Lucie, Florida, which is on the east coast of Florida, if you're familiar. It's between, like, it's north of West Palm Beach, north of Stewart, south of Fort Pierce. I remember my dad coming outside, and, you know, I was out riding my bike. I was like, let me see, I would have been like 6 years old at this time. But I was out riding my bike, and my dad said, hey, because he watched it on the TV, and then he went outside, and he's like, hey, stay right here and turn this way. So he faces me towards the east, you know, towards the Atlantic Ocean, and you know, we see that Saturn V rocket, you know, off in the distance, blasting into space. What's interesting is that 650 million people watched it live, and this was about, you know, it took the astronauts about 4.5 days to get up to the moon, but it was, people were just glued to their TVs whenever they could be. There's a famous picture of Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time. Oh no, you know what? I take it back. Nixon was president, but maybe I'm thinking of Johnson watching another launch. But I want to back up for just a second, because a while ago I mentioned the Apollo 14 mission that went to the moon also, and somebody commented that it's fake news or whatever, that humans have been to the moon, and I said, are you serious? You know, because I know there are conspiracy theorists out there that, you know, we didn't go to the moon, or no human beings went to the moon. And I said, well, why do you think that? He's like, because of the Van Allen belts. So just to update you, if you're keeping score at home, what are the Van Allen belts? Well, the Van Allen belts were discovered by this astrophysicist named Van Allen. And Van Allen belts, they basically are outside, and I'm going to show you a picture in a second of the trajectory of Apollo 11. And where they transited the Van Allen belts. But basically, if you look at the globe, say the globe's here, this is the North Pole, the Van Allen belts kind of go out and around and then back in. Now, if you know anything about the Earth's magnetism, you know that it's different in all sorts of places. Like, one of my jobs in the Navy was mine countermeasures. And one of the things that every Navy ship does is they do this process called degaussing, which is actually inducing currents in coils, which cause magnetic fields, to counter or neutralize the ship's magnetic signature vis-a-vis where we are on the Earth. So there's a lot of, there's a lot of science in this. But here's the thing, and so these belts are radiation, right? At the lower level, they're filled with protons. And at the outer levels, they're filled with very active, meaning movement, of electrons. And Van Allen himself, though, has said that they could be transited, because the Van Allen belts are radiation. But, as you well know, if you've ever sprained an ankle, right, we get exposed to radiation all the time. We get exposed to radiation from the sun, from X-rays, from other, fissionable materials. It happens, right? And we know that our bodies can absorb certain amount of radiation over certain time periods without, super negative effects, right? And so what NASA did is they calculated, okay, where can we create this trajectory through the Van Allen belts? And take a look at, this is the trajectory of Apollo 11. So, they went through this radioactive field, but the physiological effects on the humans inside, who were shielded too, is, not, I don't want to say negligible, because that's kind of an ambiguous term, but manageable, right? And NASA knew what they were looking at before they even sent people up there. And by the way, Apollo 11 was not the first spaceship to go through or into the Van Allen belts. Actually, Apollo 8 was the first one. It did an orbit, but never, didn't go to the moon. Then after Apollo 8, Apollo 10 through 17 all transited the Van Allen belts in some capacity. The other thing that I found was that even the International Space Station, at certain times in low Earth orbit, would go through sections of the Van Allen belts. And what they would do for the astronauts is they would move the astronauts into this part of the International Space Station that was the most shielded area. Now, we know from experiments that about the maximum amount of time that a human being can safely be out of the Earth's magnetosphere, which counteracts that kind of radiation, is about 500 days. That's about how long it would take to get to Mars. By the way, it took the Apollo 11 guys about 4.5 days to get to the moon. And the other thing, and just like to kind of visualize how far things are from each other, the moon is about 400,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth. The Van Allen belts only are about 60,000 kilometers out. So, and you don't pick it up until you're, at altitude. So, it's significant, but it's not like, it's not a showstopper, as we would say in the Navy. So, the folks that think that human beings can't survive, that, I'm not going to try to convince them otherwise. The science is there. If somebody said, "Hey, Terry, you want to go to the moon?" I'd be like, "Yeah, sure." If it's a long weekend, I'd go up to the moon or go around the moon. I don't, I trust, because look, life is about trusting people. It's like I trusted somebody that when they made this truck that I drive around, that the brakes would work. I test the stuff, but it doesn't mean there couldn't be failure. Any machine made by man can fail. But, it's a human endeavor, and it's important, and we learned a lot on those missions. The Artemis missions, are getting ready to start the process of going back to the moon. So I think that's pretty cool. And I hope that, you know, it renews interest in science and space travel for like younger generations. You know, when I was a kid, you know, I living in Florida, man, those Saturn V's were going up like every, you know, seemed like every 6 months. And then I've seen space shuttle launches, not at Cape Canaveral, but I was in Orlando one time when one of the space shuttles went up. So I walked outside, you know, watched it on TV, walked outside. So it's pretty cool to see. And, you know, I think the science is there. I think, you know, and look, if you think Buzz Aldrin didn't walk on the moon, tell him to his face, and then just stand by to get punched. There's a video on YouTube where he punched somebody that was basically saying that. Okay, so that's today in history. 1969, the U.S. lands astronauts on the moon. Okay, so had a meeting yesterday with 3 people in my chain of command, including some senior people in the reefer division, about the lack of, you know, publicity or announcement about the driver disappearance. And you know, it was a productive meeting. We actually met for, I think, about 1 hour and 15 minutes. So we talked about a number of things, but you know, like you know, I explained, and you know, there's a lot of people that miss the point of what people are saying. You know, there's I think it was Robert Fulghum, the author, who said, people don't listen to understand, they listen to refute or react. And, you know, and I've had to explain this to a number of people. My issue, and I think the issue with a lot of other drivers, was not what happened after Jason disappeared or was not, you know, couldn't be contacted. It wasn't about that. It wasn't about the police response or search parties or any of that. All this was about, and I've said it before, is there should have been, my belief, and some, you know, several other drivers, that they should have at least said something, right? As soon as they knew that they didn't have a driver accounted for, right? Like knew where he was, you know, and he's in the middle of picking up a load too, right? They should have promulgated that. And you know, that's all. That was my whole point. Whether or not, you know, what happened after that is an issue for the police. It's an issue for his family, him, and you know, maybe to some extent Prime. But there is absolutely no legal reason, and I'm saying this with a high degree of confidence since I'm licensed to practice law in Maryland. Yeah, I'm still licensed. My licensure is administratively suspended because I don't pay bar dues. I haven't been in court as an attorney for, you know, 4 years. No, probably closer to 5 now. But every single time somebody disappears, you know, getting that information out is like job one. I mean, even before sometimes searches start, you know, getting the information out. And by the way, a lot of times searchers come because they know something happened, right? And you know, and as a lawyer, we like to analogize things. So let me just analogize something, and then I'll mention something else that was in the news. So I was a volunteer firefighter for 6 years, and you know, I answered a lot of calls over the years, and I can't remember ever you know, going to a house that was on fire where somebody didn't like notify somebody, like they called 911, right? And what I mean by that is that when we rolled up on a fire, we didn't stand around going, oh, hey, let's figure out whether this was arson or an accident or spontaneous combustion, and then we'll decide if we're gonna, ask for help, right? That's not how things work. Like if your house is on fire, you don't say, well, let me find out if this was a good reason for the house to be on fire. You just tell somebody. And that's all I wanted, in this instance. More information is better. If there's a hurricane coming, I don't have to know all the meteorological information and how many, the pressure in the eye and the eye wall replacement cycle. I just need to know it's coming. I just need somebody to share some information with me and let me assess what I should do about that, if anything. And so that was the whole issue. Now, I did talk since I had an audience. And by the way, I got to admit, I was a little concerned about being, called to a meeting. It's like, it's like when a guy in the mafia gets called to a meeting, he might just disappear. No, I was a little concerned, but I would say my level of nervousness was about what I would have had going into court. Like I've been in court, like, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say at least 1,000 times I've appeared in court representing a client. But even after I'd been practicing for a long time, every once in a while I would just be like, I could feel my armpits, getting sweaty and stuff. So I was kind of at that level yesterday because I didn't know exactly how the meeting was going to go. But I think it was productive. And as I said to somebody, it's kind of like there's this term in finance called conditioning the market. And I said, I feel like this is conditioning the market, right? Like I went there, had a civil discussion with some people that I work for, or I contract with, and expressed some concerns that I have and that I know other drivers have because they tell me. It was not a, they talked about social media and, the negativity. Stop. You go lay down. Go lay down. It's just a little dog. You stop. Hey, I'm doing a show here. But I said, look, I get that there's negativity, right? Like if you watch the news, right? I'm doing a show here. Shush. If you watch the news, a lot, like news is negative, right? Like nobody reports that a plane flew from New York to Los Angeles and landed without incident, right? Nobody cares. And so the idea that there's a lot of negativity on social media should not be surprising, but there's also positivity. And I think there's a lot of drivers, especially at Prime, that, are very balanced. And I told them, I said, a large part of my life I've spent in high achieving organizations, right? And I want to continue to do that. And I told him, I said, I think Prime is not perfect, but it's the best option for me, certainly, and it's the best option for a lot of people that want to drive a truck. Prime has its faults, but on balance, I've been at 3 other trucking companies. On balance, I think Prime does a pretty good job, and I certainly have spoken positively about Prime, and sometimes I've even spoken glowingly about Prime. And I told them, I said, every time I said I think Prime's lease program is good, it's the best in the industry, I said people slam me, even when I'm sticking up for Prime. But I said, but I'm also, a guy who calls things like I see them. When I was in the Navy, I didn't just go, oh, the Navy's great, and let me get promoted. I told them, I said, I used to talk to 4 stars, and they would say, Chief, let me ask you about this. You know, they didn't say that because they were trying to be nice, right? They said it because they really wanted to know what I was thinking. And, you know, I worked for Marine officers, same thing. Chief, what do you know, like I had a colonel I worked for, he'd go around the table, the lieutenants, the, you know, the other, like, Chief, what do you think? And I tell him. And, you know, I've always been like that. I'm not afraid to share my opinion, because what I think is, if I have an idea, I think it's going to make the organization better. And so I hope that if this ever happens in the future, that Prime, you know, will maybe look at it a little bit differently. Maybe they'll look at it from the driver's perspective. I mean, I think that's the best thing at any company, right? That everybody understands the strengths, weaknesses, limitations of everybody else. That's how you know, that's how you put, it's not just getting everybody on the bus, right? It's putting people in the right seats on the bus. And I know, you know, a truck driver is a truck driver is a truck driver, right? But we all have strengths and weaknesses, including even executives at companies, right? And, you know, the other thing that I will say, that a lot of times people at Prime talk about their years of experience at Prime, not drivers, but like people at the corporate level. And, you know, I think that's valuable, that experience, because it's industry experience. But I also think that it creates blind spots. And I hope that they understand that, because when you know, it's like in the military, people move around all the time, right? So you don't get this stasis, so you don't get people just like super comfortable in a position where they never, you know, are receptive to like any new ideas or innovation. So, you know, and but by the way, that is not something that's exclusive to Prime. That is very common in this industry, because sometimes this is a unique industry, but it's very common. I will say that trucking companies that are publicly held are more likely to not have that problem, or less likely to have it, I guess is a better way to say it. You know, people move around from company to company. You know, I think that, like, for instance, Knight Swift, in adding other trucking companies to the mix, you know, information is shared, best practices are created, right? But when you have a privately held company, you know, you get less new blood, I think. But having said all that, I still think Prime's the place I want to be, and I shared that with them. I said, you know, I want to be here 8 more years. It's not because I'm, you know, like, oh, I'm doing 10 years and at Prime and punching out. It's just, it's a, you know, at that point I'll be 68 years old. I think I'll be, you know, ready to do something else. I won't do nothing at all, but I'll do something else. So anyway, you know, again, positive meeting. I think they understand what the concern was. And, you know, like I said, I'm not, if somebody just wants to go in, you know, leave, that's their business. But until somebody knows that, it's like if you went swimming and you didn't come back when you were expected, would you want people to go, oh, he just maybe he's swimming more, you know, like sometimes he liked to swim in the river after dark, you know, or maybe he decided to swim across the entire Chesapeake Bay today instead of just like 100 yards from shore. I mean, you know, you would be like, there's something amiss. And until we find out what it is, and maybe the person that was swimming just swam to a bar, but that's fine. But until you know, you at least got to say something. And that's true about anything, you know? So anyway, I appreciate everybody's support. A lot of people stopped me, said, hey, I appreciate what you did. And, you know, So thank you, and yeah, let's get back to work. Bye.